CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Premier Li Keqiang said in his annual government work report that China faces a far more complicated and grave situation both at home and abroad as it steps up economic development and aims to play a greater international role. 2017 could be uneasy for China surrounding the new U.S. President Donald Trump's administration. Is a China-U.S. trade war imminent? Is China still attractive for foreign investors? And will the renminbi depreciate or appreciate? Joining me to discuss all of these questions are an distinguished panel. Let me introduce them to you. They are Claire Pearson, Chairman of the British Chamber of Commerce in China; Michele Geraci, Head of the China Economic Policy Program from the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China; Tim Stratford, partner of Covington and Berlin LLP; Charles Liu, founder of How Capital; Xiang Songzuo, Deputy Director from Renmin University's International Monetary Institute; and David Wu, PwC China's Beijing Senior Partner. Welcome to this special roundtable discussion of The Point. I'm Lu Xin. In 2017, one of the issues people will probably have to deal with is trade wars, especially between China and the United States. I know it's kind of a doomsday theory that the media always play, but unfortunately that's on everybody's lips. So let's talk about it. And Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Donald Trump have voiced their respective opinion on this regard.
搞保护主义，如同把自己关入黑屋子。
Pursuing protectionism is like locking oneself in a dark room. While wind and rain may be kept outside, that dark room will also block light and air. No one will emerge as a winner in a trade war.
I believe strongly in free trade, but it also has to be fair trade. It's been a long time since we had fair trade.
In the just released U.S. President trade agenda for 2017, Donald Trump's team has said that they're going to pay much more attention to freer trade and fairer trade. So I would like to ask all of you this question to start with. Which goes first, free trade or fair trade, or are they mutually exclusive? Do we have to choose between one of them?
I think ideally you have to have both of them, and you can only have a sustainable relationship if you do have both of them. What happens is if a population or a country believes that trade is not being conducted fairly or it's not working for them, they'll have a popular uprising, or there'll be other political forces that will cause the country to make some adjustment. And I think that's what's happening in the United States right now. I think there's a pretty broad consensus now that the trade relationship with China has not been as fair as it could be, and that the U.S. has suffered from that. And on one level, you can talk about the trade deficit and how the U.S. trade deficit with China has quadrupled since China joined the WTO 16 years ago. But I don't think that really gets to the heart of the problem. I think a lot of companies that are doing business here feel distressed because they're not allowed to do in China what Chinese companies are allowed to do in the States. And they believe that sets up unfair advantages, and that over the long run, it can have a big negative impact on the U.S. economy.
Tim, I totally disagree. I don't think it's a question of fair trade where Americans have lost out. Americans have gained so much by being able to buy goods at prices which they would not have been able to afford to buy if it was all manufactured in Detroit or in the U.S. What we have is a situation in which there's a good portion of the U.S. population left behind in the new global order. They lost, not because of China, because of automation, higher productivity, higher efficiency, and the economies of scale that China has produced. Is that unfair? What is really unfair is the way U.S. society has not been able to treat those who've been left behind by globalization.
I think unfair is very hard to define, the fair or unfair. And now international trade, I think, has been determined in the past decades by the so-called International Labor of Division. So it's very hard to define fair or unfair. And if you want to do that, you must find a criteria to define it.
Yeah, do we have that kind of definition at this moment?
And now the members of Trump administration and some economics define fair or unfair according to trade deficit or current account deficit. I don't think that's a right definition.
I think the problem is that when country A trades with country B, we know that opening up trade, lowering barrier benefits both countries, on average. The problem is that this average is then not always redistributed fairly within the country. So whilst the US even benefits from even having a trade deficit, better to keep the door open with a negative trade balance than shutting the door. On average, the US economy would grow, but that growth then gets concentrated in the hands of a few people. Maybe there are some people at the low end that yes benefit from buying cheaper goods from China, but if a country does not have income redistribution mechanism within the country itself, then it creates the problem of the 1%, 99%. We see that in Europe, we see the growth of populism. That's why maybe Trump appealed to the ones who were left behind. And so there is a problem that countries have not yet solved. In the long term, the whole country benefits, but in the short term, people lose jobs and they get angry.
Claire?
Yeah, I think you make a good point. Fair, not fair. What does it come down to? Who writes the rules? The last century, America pretty well wrote the international trade rules. What is WTO? It's the post-war consensus. Now we've got Xi Jinping appearing at Davos and sounding like the savior of free trade. Donald Trump, he's a CEO before he's a president. Listen to his State of the Nation speech. One comment about China. Is it complimentary? No. He's a classic CEO. He's got to find somebody to blame for his own economic woes at home. China. Since China joined the WTO, we've had 60,000 factories closed.
The timing might be right, but the cause and effect.
Yeah, I mean, he's just throwing it out there because you need a problem when you're a CEO at the beginning of your reign, so you can have a solution at the end and get re-elected in 4 years. He's smart, throw it out, it's all China's fault. But at the end of the day, CEOs, they create problems, but they need to be practical to create solutions. And although Donald is playing to a certain unemployed audience at home, when he gets to the US, don't think he's not going to build a Trump Tower next to the US Embassy in Beijing. Of course he is. That guy is a construction guy #1 and a politician #2. And he's going to build a world that's good for him to do business in 8 years when he's unemployed, or 4.
David?
Yeah, the simple rule is if there's no free trade, there will be no fair trade. So we need to promote trade. And trade brings prosperity, to humanity, in the world.
I agree with most of what I've heard the rest of you say that are sort of criticizing some of what you're hearing from the United States. But it doesn't change a couple of things. First of all, if you look at the American business community doing business in China, 81% of them now in a survey say that they feel less welcome here than they did before. And this long predates Trump. It is a reflection of they're trying to do business here. They're looking at China's industrial policies, and they're looking at the things that are closed off for them. They look at their Chinese competitors getting quite wealthy in a market that's closed, and then those Chinese competitors going overseas and starting to buy up prime assets in other countries, in their industries.
You have led the discussion into a very interesting point I would like to talk more about. That is whether China continues to be an attractive destination for foreign direct investment with a rising US dollar and a series of measures by US President Donald Trump to attract foreign direct investment, and India coming up very strong to attract foreign direct investment. At the same time, how is China perceived in its attractiveness to foreign direct investment? Let's take a listen of what Premier Li Keqiang said during his report to the MPC session.
We will encourage foreign invested firms to be listed and issue bonds in China and allow them to take part in national science and technology projects. Foreign firms will be treated the same as domestic firms when it comes to license applications, standards settings and government procurement, and will enjoy the same preferential policies under the Made in China 2025 initiative.
Will, and under these measures, if clearly implemented, how will that change China's attractiveness in the eyes of foreign direct investors? And I wanted to follow on your question. The problem, many people are complaining about China not being as attractive as it was before. Is it a problem of perception or is it a problem of reality?
I think the point is not the policy, the governmental policy has changed. I think the point is the rising cost of labor and the environmental concern. I think Premier and other leaders make it very clear China will open further and more open to foreign business investors. However, why more and more foreign entrepreneurs are worried about doing business here? Yeah. I think the key point is a rising cost of everything, not policy.
If you look at the U.S. companies, though, they're principally here not to take advantage of China's comparative advantage to produce something that then they sell around the world. They're focused on the China market. And therefore, the costs are not as relevant. According to the survey that I referred to a minute ago, the policies are the greatest concerns. Of course, it's a challenge. Labor costs, other things are definitely a challenge. But that's not the thing that discourages them. The things that discourages them are the policies and the promises that they hear, and then they feel that they're not carried out. And so that's the perception. The other factors may be true, but that's not what's driving the business sentiment.
Of course, policy is one concern, important concern, yeah.
But is it, yes, go ahead.
But there's one thing, because we talk always about returns, and we say, what's the cost, what's the return that a foreign investor make in China, and I'm sure Charles would agree with me. We have to look at the risk. I never see in the media discussion about the risk. We have to talk about return compared to the risk. And even if China returns are now shrinking, China, I think, has an opportunity to also lower the investment risk for foreign investors. And one way to do that is to add clarity. Investors need clarity. Bad news is better than no news. We cannot have things like we had last year with the stock market intervention, circuit breakers for one day, then stopping, then out. People just shun away from this kind of environment. So even if, like you were saying, the costs are increasing, the return of China becomes less attractive relative to the other countries, China still has another door completely open, which is make clarity on the engagement rules. And once these rules are set, they should not be changed in due course. Mm-hmm. It's like changing the rules of the game during a football match. We want to know how we play for at least those 90 minutes. And for this, China has an opportunity, but China needs to decide, and I don't think it's ready yet, if it wants to follow this path of making clarity. Because uncertainty creates also opportunity for those who run the uncertainty.
Yeah, I think what Premier Li Keqiang said during this government work report, and I was trying to pick up hints and bits, and he was basically hinting that there are some policy room for China's structural reform. So maybe that's the kind of thing you were talking about. And also he emphasized that the government also needs to be credible. A government needs to keep its promise. A new official cannot tear up the existing or old contracts. That's what he said, and that's where people gave him a lot of applause for that. Claire?
Yeah, I really like this point about risk. I think risk can be offset with relationship, because China still offers economies of scale not available at home. It's about the people. It's about the domestic market. It's about 20% of the world being here, and with Belt and Road, China being connected to 80%, while TPP is falling over. Europe is 6% of the world, the US is 4%. My brother has a small business in the north of England that will make 80% of his profit. But when he opens in Ningbo 10 years ago, one client equals 20 European clients. Economy of scale cannot be taken away from you. The risk is worth it. Yes, we need lower tax. I've worked here for 12 years. When I arrived, I was rich on my salary because I'd come from Hong Kong with very low tax. The tax does kill you, but it also forces you to be more enterprising. So thank you, Li Keqiang. If you can reduce that tax, we'll have more disposable income to spend on Chinese products. Yeah. And that will help people stay, have sustainable business, and realize the economy of scale that only China offers at the moment.
Yeah. I would agree with everything that's been said with a different perspective. China is in a transition. China now is no longer a capital importer. China is a capital exporter. Major industrial companies, the Fortune 500, came to China to tap onto the low wages and the hard-working masses of China. Today, they are drooling over the Chinese market. They're in a transition too. China's in transition, they're in a transition. So everybody's in a transition. You can't look at China from the eyes of the 20 years ago who've been here. You have to look into the future. And looking into the future, you have to accept China will become a capital exporter. And when you talk about foreign investment, 25 years ago when I started making investments in China, it was industrial investment, in industrial capital. Today, we're talking more and more about financial capital. All of this is different. It's much more complex than what, unfortunately, the media has been capable of describing.
So maybe the question of whether China is attractive still is not a relevant question anymore.
It's a simplistic way.
It's a simplistic
way of describing something which is in transition and far more complex than what is being described.
But still, I think it's very important to recognize the global CEO's confidence in China market is still high. Because China, US, and German still ranked the highest or attractive market for global capital. And in China, I fully agree with Claire has said, we have a growing middle-class population. And that growing middle-class population gets into second generation. Their consumption demand is much higher. And that will bring up the attractiveness. And also very, very important is the new economy, which the digital economy in China is taking place. The e-commerce, the logistics supporting the e-commerce in China is also
mobile payment.
It's happening. It's real. You can you can experience that.
We have to take a short break. You have been watching The Point here on CGTN. I'll be back right after this. Over the last 3 years, for instance, China has signed industrial capacity cooperation agreements with more than 20 Belt and Road countries and built 52 economic and trade cooperation regions in 18 such countries. It is fair to say the realization of the Belt and Road Initiative is not only boosting the industrialization of the countries within the area, but also getting them on the map of economic globalization via the China Bridge. So when it comes to the economic background of this Belt and Road, some people are actually questioning, some people in the West are saying that China just want to dump its excess industrial capacity, its steels, its infrastructure capabilities. Is that true?
I would just like to say, I think that's a very negative perspective that you're getting from the West, who might just be a little bit jealous because possibly their Middle East policy in the last 50 years hasn't been so successful. Don't ask the Western media about Belt and Road. Ask somebody on it. Ask somebody who...
Pakistan.
Ask an Afghan farmer.
Yeah.
I talk from the perspective of the small businessman. I'm the chair of a Chamber of Commerce. 80% of our clients are SME. What they rely on is what China has given them. If you wake up in Shanghai and you need to get to your factory in Ningbo, you can get the subway and you can get a train. It is only going to set you back 250 renminbi. Time is money for the small business person. What China has achieved in its own continent to enable the small businessman, it is trying to export that economic opportunity and connectivity to people who are currently outside global economic opportunity. The world is increasingly polarized. Haves, haves not, migration resulting from that. That's the issue this century. And China is trying to preempt the issues that create ISIS. It is trying to preempt the issues that create trade wars. Belt and Road, I was born in a Belt and Road country, and I have a scar on my leg because I received an injection from a nurse with a rusty needle because we weren't near a decent hospital. It's not just about economic inclusion, it's about health opportunity for ordinary people. And this is going to bring sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East onto the global economic map. That is 80% of the world's population. If you can give these people the opportunity to earn their own living, you simultaneously get rid of a terrorism threat, which has nothing to do with religion. Donald Trump can shut up about anti-Muslim this and anti-this. People with no money and no doctor and no job opportunity blow themselves up.
Well,
People with a Belt and Road don't.
Well, I'm glad you say that. Unfortunately, I don't know how many people in the West actually think like you. Quite opposite. They would really challenge. They would really question China's intention when Chinese investor, when Chinese government come and say, let's pave the road for you. They say, what do you want to do? What is behind all of that? I don't know. It seems like the more you come with a good intention, the more people question you.
I just invested in a project in Pakistan as part of the One Belt, One Road. And I can tell you, for the local population, they're ecstatic, like you said.
They're ecstatic.
But what's more important, I think, in geopolitical context and macroeconomic context, it's not a question of dumping excess capacity. It's really a question of China becoming a capital exporter. What do you do when you do capital export? Do you do what Wang Jianling does in going to buy movie studios in Hollywood or football clubs in Europe? No, the government will not do that. When you do capital export and you build infrastructure in surrounding countries, what you end up with is economic integration of these countries with your country at the core.
That's true.
That's the end result. Strategically, that's the end result.
I think One Belt, One Road initiative is a so broad, so long-term strategy initiative. So we cannot discuss One Belt, One Road initiative focusing on one point, dumping of excess production. Well, maybe, but that's not
that's
key
the
point.
Result.
That's not key point.
That's the
result. Yes. And according to official figures, so far we invest $18 billion in so-called Belt Road countries so far. Majority, almost most of these investments are infrastructure. Highway or port. All this infrastructure, railway. I think, is railway very much helpful for these countries. And of course, will be helpful for Chinese investors and enterprises to do business there. So I think it's a multiple initiative, geopolitical, trade, investment, currency, everything, culture.
But it does create a little bit of friction, maybe in some recipient countries that do not fully understand the reasons. And that's why maybe we should make an effort, we foreigners living here, to explain to our guys in the West why is China doing it. It's not to dump steel, it's to maybe develop infrastructure. But then infrastructure is a tricky thing because there are sensitive infrastructure and there are non-sensitive infrastructure. So if you build a road, it's fine. If you buy a port, it gets a bit tricky. If you buy telecom infrastructure, it gets even more tricky. So what did you do in Pakistan?
No. What I did in Pakistan was, as part of the One Belt, One Road initiative, anything you build, like railways, ports, you need electricity.
Yeah.
Good
so
point.
I co-invested with a Chinese company to put in a solar station.
That's solar electricity. That will also benefit the local people.
Exactly.
Sure, and this kind of project is always welcome.
Clean electricity.
Yeah. But Tim, I find you quite quiet for quite a while. Is that because the United States has not really been part of the Belt and Road initiative?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
When I talk with current U.S. government officials, former government officials, people in the think tanks, I find very few people who want to criticize One Belt, One Road. I think that the opposition on the United States might have come from one or two people in particular positions at a particular time, but everyone I talk to thinks that the fact that the United States was pegged as opposing it was a mistake, and I see very positive feelings towards it. I think in terms of dealing with steel capacity and so on, it's a lot better to find additional uses for steel than to dump them in existing markets where there's supply in excess of demand. So I don't think that's a problem. I think the only concern I hear is that, of course, as China expands its economic contributions, it also expands its political influence. Yeah. And so not only from the United States, but also from some other countries in the region, what I hear are concerns is that sometimes China uses economic influence to pressure countries for political goals that the local countries are not in favor of. And I think that is probably the number one concern that might have. And you see examples of that with Korea right now, where they feel like they're getting pressured economically because of political reasons. And that's the only concern that I see that I think is serious, because I think the other concerns are red herrings.
A wild guess. Wouldn't it be nice if the United States is also part of the Belt and Road Initiative? Then you can benefit all of us. Well, everybody will win.
There are American companies that are involved. And I don't think, the Chinese government and the infrastructure bank and so on, they've all made clear that American companies are welcome, and they're delighted to be participating.
So the window is open.
Yeah, I don't think
Canada's joined.
Yeah, I don't think that the opposition from the West is as strong as maybe you fear.
But Trump said in his first speech, our infrastructure will be second to none. And there's one country that has now the #1 infrastructure in the world, and that's China. So in that way, if you want to be a bit optimistic, the US is already part of the One Belt, One Road, and meaning our infrastructure needs to be better than China. The US needs China, capital, steel,
Will that create, however, more trade deficit, or?
It would be a tricky thing, because you will have a trade on a current account, maybe deficit, which the US cannot do without, but it may have a positive capital inflow. So that's how the US can balance it. They will absorb the 360 billion of current account deficit, and they will reinvite once, of course, first you give jobs to the people working in the steel mill in the US, but that's not going to be enough to make JFK Airport a airport from the biggest country and richest country in the world, because if you're arriving in FJK, you think you're arriving in a, I cannot say which other country.
Yeah, I just think when you get on a train and you're just a business guy without a car, like me, you just need to get from A to B cheaply. China's the only place that lets you do that. I arrive in Houston, I can't get the train. You've got to pay for a car. This century is going to be, countries that are going to be attractive are those that are environmentally sound, that they're not polluting the rest of the world, and economically they provide economic opportunity for the people at the bottom of the pile. China is the only place that's built a viable railway infrastructure across a continent. My friends in Ethiopia don't complain about the political intrusion of a Chinese train. They're just very happy that they can get their shoes to the port in Djibouti. My view is that Junli Kuhn, he's not starting a bank, he's starting a think tank. He's academic and able, go for it.
We have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us today. Wonderful topics, but we have to leave it there. So you have been watching a special roundtable discussion of The Point with Mi Liuxing here on CGTN. As usual, here's my last point. Running an enterprise like China PLC is no easy task. Why am I saying that? You have to keep the growth rate to provide over 10 million jobs every year, but you also have to strike a balance between the quality and the quantity of the growth. You need to give enough room for domestic enterprises to flourish. You also have to stay attractive to international investors, so a lot of balances to strike. Meanwhile, risks, both domestic and international, threaten to destabilize the Chinese market at any time. In Chinese Premier Li Keqiang's words, we are running an uphill battle with obstacles all along the way. So stability, for the moment, is the key. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time on CGTN.